Hey there, welcome to Cumberland Conversations. This is the place where we talk about the issues that matter most to you, your patients, and your community. We're diving into real conversations with real people, sharing insights you can actually use. Let's get the conversation started. Hi, I'm Rob Lillard, Medical Director for the Cumberland Pediatric Foundation, and welcome back to Cumberland Conversations, Episode 1. We're going to do our journal club today, and we're excited about this. We're going to review a couple of articles. We may even do a bonus article if we have time. And the way we want this to work is if you have any questions that come up during the course of the review, feel free to email us at cpfnashville@gmail.com, and we may be able to come back and answer those questions or discuss them a little bit more in future episodes. Well, I am happy to be joined today by our good friend and Vice President of CPF, soon to be President, Dr. Buddy Creech.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well,
Excited to do this.
Well, we have picked out a couple of real softballs for you to start with because they are right down your alley in infectious disease. And so the first article we wanted to talk about comes out of Clinical Infectious Diseases, and this was, I think, in November of 2024. Long-term dynamics of measles virus-specific neutralizing antibodies in children vaccinated before 12 months of age. Okay, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it. What did you see when you go through this article?
Well, the first thing I would say is clinical infectious diseases, or CID, is probably not the first place everybody goes to. It's sort of Nerd Fest 101 for us. But CID and JID are two of the more high-profile journals that we have. Kathy Edwards was a longtime editor of CID, so it's highly respected. So things that come in this journal, we really like. And I say that from the outset because I think it's more and more important as publications expand, as AI expands, where things are published remains really important. So that's the first step. And then I would say,
who may be listening who don't know Kathy Edwards very well, she is amazing. She was at Vanderbilt for a long time, recently retired. But if you've been around Nashville for a long time, you know and respect Kathy.
Well, in every vaccine that we have, she's had a finger on in order to either see it tested in children or seen the effects of epidemiology once those vaccines have been introduced. All right, so I think about four things when looking at a paper. And this is sort of my rubric all the time. It's what's the question? What did they do? What did they find? And what does it matter? So those are kind of that's the rubric. So what was the question? The question was, now that we're seeing a resurgence of measles, and for these guys, it was in the Netherlands. So this Dutch group had an explosion of measles in the mid-2010s. The question was, when they give MMR earlier than the 12 to 14 months they normally do, does that have any long-term effect on the immune system response of the kid? We know that there can be some short-term things. The question is 5-6 years later, is there still an impact? So what they do, they compared kids who got vaccinated in the first year of life before they turned 1 with the kids who got a normal vaccine, the MMR1, at 14 months of age. And then they followed them out through 6 years, including booster doses of vaccine, just to see what the immune response looked like. And so what did they find? They found that if you give that MMR 0, which doesn't count for the 2-dose series, we all know that. If you give it before 8.5 months, there's probably enough maternal antibody floating around, or the B cell compartment is still immature enough that there's actually a reduction long-term in the amount of neutralizing antibody that's made. Neutralizing antibody is probably an important distinction here. So we can measure antibodies that stick to viruses, and we can measure how well those antibodies actually keep that virus from infecting a cell. Those neutralizing antibodies are more important than the ones that just stick to them. It means they're doing something. So this has, I think, import for us because as we look around the Southeast, we look at Spartanburg County in South Carolina, we look at sporadic cases in Tennessee and around, I think we have to be very slow to adopt an early MMR 0, except in some really specific situations where we know the child needs it. International travel, known exposure, known outbreak setting. But giving it to the population just to be safe, I think we have to acknowledge first do no harm, and there may actually be harm. Now, this study is one of many studies that's been looked at for this. Plenty of data from Haley Gans in California and from others that would say, well, the T-cell response is still just as good. The booster ability of another dose or the way to recover that is still pretty good.
And that to be fair, that's something that we really don't measure. That's exactly right, because this is what we can measure. It's easy to measure, but and I think the paper made the point that everyone's titers fall off slowly. It's just when we did it early, it fell off more.
But you think it's more quickly.
State.
That's right.
But we don't know how many of those kids exposed to measles may still be helpful.
That's exactly right. So at the end of the day, we don't need maximum levels of circulating antibody to be protected, right? We need a little bit to neutralize it at first. We need a really good memory response so that we can recall really good antibodies. And we need a functional T cell response to kill those cells that are infected early on. And I think it's those three parts of the stool working together that really give us protection against measles. But I think the take-home point here is that even though most 6-month-olds do not have sufficient circulating antibody in their bloodstreams to be able to protect against a measles exposure, we shouldn't just go out and start vaccinating them willy-nilly. We probably need to wait until there is international travel, known exposure, known outbreak. And then even in that regard, boy, I think waiting until 8.5, 9 months of age where you can is wonderful.
And we've talked about this before too. And I think in this study, they kept on the schedule. So I think every child got the MMR1 at 14 months.
That's right.
A little later than what we might do here. But then they don't get that final booster till I believe it's 9.
Right.
Right. So, and there's a little bit of differences in how that works. And we've talked about maybe delaying MMR1 if you give, an 11-month-old
that's right.
MMR0,
right?
That you might wait and do it a little bit later.
There's a lot and we just don't know. There's a lot of ways to do this, right? One strategy would be to give MMR0 whenever you absolutely have to, as early as 6 months of age. Give MMR1 sometime after their first birthday. I think the real question for us in the U.S. is when are we going to start giving MMR2? Because remember that MMR really isn't a booster for measles. It's to catch that 5% of kids who, because of maternal antibody or maybe immaturity of their B cell compartment, simply don't respond to that first dose. So we get 95 to 99% protection once we give that second dose. And I think this was one of the reasons why there was an initial discrepancy between the AAP recommendation in the 90s and the ACIP recommendation about when that second dose should happen. In the rest of the world, they give MMR2 a lot earlier. They might give 12 to 15 months and then maybe the second birthday or the third birthday. And this is just me talking without any data to support, which is why not? It's a conversation. I think the very first thing we would do if we need to is to get that second dose just a little bit sooner in the context of waning immunity rather than trying to hurry that first dose.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense. And I believe the 4-year-old, 5-year-old, that was chosen more out of convenience.
Correct.
Because it's exactly right, kindergarten. And since that time, I mean, the whole vaccine schedule and visit schedule has changed.
That's right.
We're doing Hep A at 18 months or 2 years. And so there's the opportunity there to move that up.
I think that's exactly right. What we do want is to get it before they enter kindergarten, just because we know we need so much herd protection or population immunity to measles, because it's the second most contagious virus on the planet behind smallpox. And so we really need high levels of protection in the community.
Now, you may not know this, but do you know since this paper's come out, have the Dutch, have they changed their second dose? Have they moved it from 9 years?
I don't think they have. I think they are still using this general platform because they have a nationalized health service. They have good epidemiology. They continue to have outbreaks. And I think during those outbreak scenarios, they do accelerate that second dose.
Okay.
But I think generally their EPI, their expanded program on immunizations is still this.
Well, again, that's another big difference and why we can't generalize findings. In other countries, the U.S., we have totally different healthcare systems.
That's right.
Totally different follow-up. So we have our own issues.
That's exactly right. Yep.
Great. I think that's wonderful. And like I said, if people have questions about that, review the paper. There's a lot of great information in there. Send us a question and I'll track this guy down and shoot something out there.
I love it.
Answer any questions.
I love it.
All right. We're going to throw the second softball now. And this paper was really just a review paper that was in pediatrics. It was in March of 2026. There's been a lot of banter now about adjuvants and how negative people think they might be. And so this was a review about the role and safety of aluminum adjuvants in childhood vaccines. So really not a study to go over, but just kind of a review. And I learned something in the first paragraph. I was saying earlier that I knew adjuvants have been around for a while. I did not realize 100 years that aluminum was one of the first. It was the first adjuvant, I believe, right, going back to 1925. And for the longest time was the only adjuvant in a vaccine. Really works well for a lot of those protein subunit vaccines. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. When we have things like whole cell pertussis vaccine or live attenuated measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, where you have the entire pathogen or most of the pathogen, those pathogens inherently adjuvant, either through lipopolysaccharide or other viral proteins that stimulate the inflammasome or toll-like receptors that are on the surface of all of our cells telling us to freak out when there's an invader. But when all you have is a little piece of a vaccine, a little piece of a protein that's in that, you really need something to signal to the immune system to care about this. Otherwise, you just don't. And we've learned this through a variety of vaccines where we try not to adjuvant the vaccine. We don't get good titers. We don't get good responses. We put aluminum in there and it's lights out. So aluminum works in a couple of different ways. And I should say, first off, I love the fact that in the United States, we decided just to drop an I from an element. So all of our European colleagues call it aluminium, which sounds very fancy, and maybe we'd get a little more acceptance if we called it aluminium.
Yeah, kind of exceptional.
Yeah, it just sounds very sophisticated to say aluminium. But there are different forms of it. There's different aluminum salts, aluminum phosphate, aluminum hydroxide, and they just form different structures microscopically. And I think the reason that's important is aluminum does a couple of things. It forms a depot for the antigen so that the antigen doesn't completely spread out and get lost and diffused. So it keeps it in a relatively local place in the muscle. But the second thing it does is it activates the inflammasome. It ticks off your dendritic cells and your macrophages to say, care about this thing I'm attached to. So I think that's the reason we use it. And I think we need to make sure patients and their families know that the reason we're doing this is so we can use a very small amount of the vaccine target and so that we can drive the immune response the way we want it to. So it's intentional that we're adding aluminum. It's not a leftover. It's not a byproduct. It's not a contamination. That's right. And I think in the world of excipients, which is one category that a lot of the folks who have vaccine questions are asking about, whether that's formaldehyde, whether that's fetal cells that might be in some of the vaccines that come from viruses, or whether it's aluminum, the reason people have questions are different about each one of those. But I think it's important, maybe take home number one is that aluminum is supposed to be in some of our vaccines because it allows us to keep the dose of the vaccine very small.
Yeah. So I think that, how that works was something that I had kind of forgotten about if I ever learned it in medical school. But so if you want to go, and I'll spare you that, but if you want to go back and read the article, it really talks about how that mechanism works and stimulates the cells like you talked about. But the other thing that you mentioned, I think, is one of the most important because I think people tend to view it as, oh, you are getting a lot of toxin that you're injecting into my muscle and it's going to go through the bloodstream. But going back to your point about the depot, it forms a depot. It is a very slow release into the bloodstream. When you give the shot, you don't see a rise in aluminum in the serum.
No.
And the kidneys handle that extremely well.
Well, and not only that, but we have proteins circulating in our bloodstream like transferrin that bind to these sort of cationic peptides or cationic elements. And so not only do we know how to tie it up, it actually doesn't get into the bloodstream very much. There are studies in premature infants. So if you're going to see aluminum in the bloodstream of somebody, wouldn't it be a preterm baby where the amount per body weight is higher, where they're immature, their vascular system is immature, maybe they're more leaky? 24 hours after a vaccine, we do not see aluminum in the bloodstream of even premature infants. Yeah. So this is really, it maintains itself locally, and it is not a harm. And I think the other thing I would say is, I think it's important to talk to parents about how does this stack up compared to what we see in dietary exposure to aluminum. So one place that we see aluminum is in formula, especially soy-based, even breast milk. Even breast milk. There's a ton of aluminum in there, and our bodies know what to do with it. And that aluminum certainly gets into the digestive tract and gets absorbed. And yet we don't see these huge spikes, just like we don't see spikes with giving it into the muscle. Where we really don't pay attention to aluminum exposure is in nonstick cookware. Granted, some people don't use that. In aspirin, certain components of aspirin, and then in simple antacids that are aluminum-based. And they're sometimes used in infants. Huge amount of aluminum in those. And even then, we don't see any problems with aluminum. So I think the reason this article is important for us is that as this becomes the next target on the back of vaccines, we need to have some tools as pediatricians to talk to families to say, we hear your concerns, want to be empathetic towards that. Okay, what do we do with that now? And so it shouldn't prevent us from having a presumptive, strong recommendation for vaccines. That's easy enough. It shouldn't keep us from acknowledging that this question is a good question, and we should empathize with them and say, look, I get where you're coming from. I've had those same concerns, so I've looked into it. Can I share with you what I found and what's been helpful for other parents? And then you say, we do it intentionally because of the reasons we've talked about. We have large amounts of data on this. Over 1 billion people have received vaccines with aluminum-containing products. And in all of the studies that have been done, including, again, the Dutch have done a lot of good work on this, but even studies in the United States and in other countries where we do not see any association whatsoever with autism spectrum disorder, neurocognitive delays,
I was going to round that up.
any number of issues, including allergic hypersensitivity or other issues. Now, I do think we have to acknowledge that very rarely children can get sterile abscesses at the sites of injection. Some of those are thought to be from local aluminum toxicity. And some of those kids will recur after getting another aluminum-based vaccine, but it's very stochastic. We don't know who does that and who doesn't.
Now, those are for a second, because you talk about aluminum toxicity.
Yeah.
Certainly, some of the inflammation that's released in that can cause that.
That's exactly right. So that's what I mean. That's a really good point. And I probably need to be better worded instead of aluminum toxicity, but saying that there can be local effects of aluminum. And in fact, one of the things that people will point to is that if you biopsy, especially in small animal models around the site, you can see some macrophages really inflamed and those resolve. But what we do see in humans is we do see sometimes these little hypersensitivity lesions or these little abscesses that form that we think are related to the inflammation induced by aluminum. Sometimes they can form nodules under the skin.
We say that all the time with DTaP and things.
That's right. And those can be distressing, but they are not serious. They don't represent an allergy to the vaccine or to aluminum. It's just localized inflammation and toxic effects, if you will, at the local level only of that aluminum. So it sometimes makes us do some different things in choosing vaccines that have lower aluminum content where we have choice, but it shouldn't be something that disrupts the entire vaccine system that we have.
Maybe reactive instead of toxic.
I like that. Aluminum reactivity. That's much better.
And yeah, so maybe that's why the 4th and 5th doses of DTaP may feel a little bit more of that. Or
maybe. It may not be the aluminum there. It may just actually be the acellular pertussis component, the diphtheria component, that those can cause those extreme swelling reactions that you're very familiar with, especially with that 4-year-old dose. We can really light up some legs on those kids. They get CRPs that go up and a lot of swelling goes away on its own.
And then the other thing I think is obviously you don't want to introduce, or people have a fear, I guess, or concern about introducing things into the body. But again, we talked about what's in food. Infants at birth, that is going to have aluminum in the blood.
That's right. This is a ubiquitous element. It's everywhere. It's in our food. It's in our water. It's everywhere. And the amount there's a really good. Let me see if I can pull it up really.
You were born to coexist with aluminum.
Well, that's exactly right. And there's a really great example from, for some of these, I go to the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia Vaccine Education Center because I think they can be very helpful. And they talk about the fact that if you were to compare a milligram to a raisin, think about cutting one raisin into 1,000 pieces, which I don't know how you do that, but just go with me for a little bit.
Okay.
One of those 1,000 parts would be 1 milligram. All right. If we consider aluminum in the first 6 months of life, from every vaccine in the first 6 months of life combined, they would have 4 or 5 of those 1,000 pieces. By breastfeeding, 7. By food via regular formula, 38. And if soy-based formula, 117 pieces. So there's basically, 40 times as much aluminum that you're getting into the body through soy-based formula than you are through all the vaccines combined in the first 6 months of life. I think that's an important piece.
Right. And for allergy immunotherapy is another way of.
Correct.
So, yeah. So that's great. I mean, I think the bottom line is we've got 100 years of experience with safe. We just need to, again, incorporate that into our messaging and use articles like this to back us up.
So, I agree.
Awesome. Well, that is great. Do you think we have time for a bonus article?
I mean, I think we should.
All right.
Just give the people what they want.
Let's do it. This article is not new. It was actually, it's fairly new, about a year ago from JAMA Pediatrics. And it's talked about fluoride exposure and IQ scores in children. Something that has really been blown up in the media and has started to create governments are changing, fluoridation of water policies and things like that. So let's walk through this quickly. And the Tennessee Department of Health folks over there that are working in the dental program also sent a follow-up article on fluoride exposure. The initial article, again, JAMA Pediatrics of 2025, January, if you're looking for it. The follow-up article was in Science Advances. I've got that one on my shelf for sure. If you need it, let me know. All right, let's walk through this. Fluoride, they looked at a meta-analysis of a lot of correlates between fluoride exposure. They looked at water levels of fluoride. They also looked at urine levels of fluoride. Now, the urine level of fluoride is probably going to give you a better overall view of what the exposure is. Because remember, fluoride just does not come from water. It comes from your exposure of elements of the Earth's crust. So there's all sorts of different ways that you can be exposed to that. As we'll talk about in a minute, even within the United States, certain parts of the countries are more at risk for fluoride exposure. What they found is they looked in when they saw high levels of fluoride in the water. Now, we're talking levels well above 1.5, especially 2 and even up to 4 milligrams per liter. There was an inverse relationship for every 1 milligram per milliliter increase of fluoride in the water. They saw about a 1 to 1.5 range of reduction in IQ points. Now, that may not sound like much, but you got to remember if that shifts 5 points in a population, you are doubling the amount of population that has intellectual disability. So it's something to really consider. One thing to look at though with this, these were none of the data, I should say, came from the United States.
Right.
This was all and mostly Chinese data. There was some other countries. India was big. Iran, Mexico, Canada. That's about as close as we get. So I think it's interesting to look at. Here's the thing: when you got down below 1.5 milligram per liter, which by the way, right now our standard is 0.7 milligram per liter in drinking water, they really had difficulty making that association. They limited to some low bias studies and they said, there is a correlation, but now you're down to just looking at 3 studies. So it's a little bit tougher. You can't deny that this is one of the biggest public health victories that we've had as far as fluoridated water.
Yeah.
And we're looking at this even within the United States. There are certain areas, I talk about how you can't extrapolate this to the United States, but even in Tennessee, it's hard to extrapolate because we're actually a fairly low fluoride area. The Southwest United States, Upper Midwest are areas of higher fluoride in the crust or in the dirt, I should say. And here's the thing, and it really brings back PTSD. It makes you think about well water. I always have those nightmares. I'm on rounds. I wake up and I'm being asked, "Did you ask about well water versus?" No, I did not. So well water can be extremely high in certain areas.
Yeah.
And so I guess you've got to look at this, and it's very multifactorial. And there's, even within the United States, 2.9 million residents have natural fluoride exposure over that limit of 1.5. So I don't know. Did you get a chance to look?
Well, again, I go back to the rubric of what was the question? Does fluoride affect IQ? What did they do? Well, they did a meta-analysis. And I remember a mentor one time saying a meta-analysis has as much to do with analysis as metaphysics has to do with physics.
Yeah.
It's just difficult to do a meta-analysis, and you should always take them with a little bit of a grain of salt. Cochrane knows how to do it well when they do these big meta-analyses, but they're very challenging. And one of the reasons they're challenging is that the level of confidence in the data presented really varies by study. And if you've combined, in this case, they looked at 74 studies that involved 21,000 children from 11 countries. That sounds great, unless all 11 of those countries are completely different than the United States in terms of how they regulate this.
Yeah.
So already from the get-go, it doesn't matter if they have 50,000 patients and 120 studies, it's not necessarily going to reflect what's in the U.S. So they said there was a lot of bias in the publications of those studies, because if you don't find an association, that sort of negative study is hard to get published. And so I think that's why the follow-up study from the Department of Health was so important to tell us what's going on in the United States.
Right. And I think, first of all, it's an amazing study. I didn't know this was going on, but they did a high school and beyond study back in 1980.
Yeah.
And now
President Reagan was around.
Yeah. The fact that now they're seniors, and I remember 1980, that kind of bothers me a little bit. But and so what they did is they took folks that were in high school in 1980, and now they did have to do some extrapolation. That's right. They had said, we assume that you've lived here and you've been exposed to this level of water fluoride. And they also looked at the environmental sources of fluoride and levels that were out there too, by looking at groundwater. But here we are, they went back and looked in 2021, so 41 years later. First of all, they found that they actually did better cognitively in adolescence when they had fluoride exposure. And then here they are, or at least they were kind to say midlife at age 60. But again, it's not as positive, but not negative. So they couldn't find any correlation. So I think it just goes to say that, we really shouldn't make broad changes in fluoride policy.
That's right. And if you're looking just at the sample size here, there were 58,000 in the longitudinal U.S. study versus 21,000 children in the meta-analysis. And they had 13,000 of them still at age 60, which is, a little over half of what was seen in the meta-analysis. It's a huge sample size. And so I think at the end of the day, we should have a lot of confidence that fluoride exposure during childhood absolutely reduces dental caries, promotes oral health, and does not have, at least at the levels that we see in the United States, any negative impact on health, particularly cognition.
Absolutely. So, all right. So talk to your folks in the community. Don't take fluoride out of the water. And by the way, I guess we should also mention fluoride toothpaste, really not a concern.
Right.
Fluoride topically applied, again, stays on the teeth, doesn't really get absorbed systemically. So again, take care of your teeth. You're going to need them, okay?
Love it. Thanks for doing this.
Yes, this is real awesome. So I hope you all enjoyed it. And again, if you've got questions on any of these articles, things that we didn't cover, or things that you'd like to see, maybe a different moderator, sure, let me know. But we'll be back and we'll do this again. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you for joining Cumberland Conversations. We're proud to support the people who care for Tennessee's children. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode, and stay connected with CPF for more tools, trainings, and community updates. Until next time, take care.